On the morning of January 29th, 2022, in the small town of Canton, Massachusetts, people awoke to a chilling discovery. Lying in the snow, battered and unresponsive, was Boston police officer John O'Keefe. He had spent the previous evening out with his girlfriend, Karen Reed, a night that would end in tragedy and ignite a case that has divided a community, cast doubt on law enforcement, and drawn the eyes of the nation. What seemed at first like a tragic accident soon unraveled into something much more complicated. Authorities accused Reed of hitting O'Keefe with her SUV and leaving him to die, but her defense team countered with an explosive claim that O'Keefe was killed inside a house filled with fellow officers, and that Reed was being framed to protect those responsible. Tonight, we take you inside the case, the evidence, and the legal battle that has left a jury deadlocked and a town in turmoil. Welcome to Creepalachia. Before we get started, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. And if you're listening on the audio version, be sure to leave a review. I appreciate you joining me here for this case tonight. So let's start out with Act 1. It was a freezing night in Canton, Massachusetts, the kind where you don't want to be outside for more than a few minutes, let alone hours. But that's exactly where Boston police officer John O'Keefe ended up, unconscious in the snow outside a fellow officer's house. And according to the prosecutors, the person responsible for leaving him there was his girlfriend, Karen Reed. Now, if you ask the prosecution, Reed, after a night of drinking with O'Keefe, allegedly drove him to the house of Brian Albert, a fellow Boston cop, and in the process, either out of anger or intoxication, hit him with her Lexus SUV. Now, instead of calling for help, they say she drove off, leaving him in the freezing cold, where he succumbed to his injuries. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast, because if you ask Reed's defense team, they'll tell you she's not just innocent, she's a victim of a massive cover-up. They argue that O'Keefe didn't die from a hit and run. No, he was beaten inside the house by someone or multiple parties at that party, and then dumped outside to make it look like an accident. And the people who may have had a hand in it, let's just say they all happen to be very well connected. Now let's rewind. January 28th, 2022, Reed and O'Keefe were out drinking at Waterfall Bar and Grill, a local hangout spot in Canton. Friends say the couple had a complicated relationship, sometimes loving, sometimes volatile, often fueled by alcohol, so sounds pretty standard for Appalachia, even though this is on the outskirts of Appalachia. But by midnight, they were on their way to 34 Fairview Road, home of Brian Albert, a respected Boston police officer. Now, this house wasn't just a house. It was a known gathering spot for police officers and their inner circle. The kind of place where if something bad happened, you probably wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of the story. Now, at approximately 12:15 a.m., surveillance footage caught Reed's Lexus leaving the Waterfall Bar parking lot. Now, by 12:30, she and O'Keefe had arrived at the Albert home, and that's where things get a little bit murky. Now, prosecutors say Reed pulled up, and for reasons still unclear, she struck O'Keefe with her car, possibly during an argument, possibly by accident, and then sped off. Now, they claim she left him outside where he suffered severe injuries from the impact and eventually succumbed to hypothermia. They point to physical evidence, a broken taillight from her car found at the scene, O'Keefe's DNA detected on the taillight, and most damningly, they say her own words the next morning when she discovered his body, quote, "Did I hit him?" Now, let's pause for a second, because on the surface, that does sound pretty bad, but Reed's attorneys say context is everything, and we know that. So the defense paint an entirely different picture, one that sounds less like drunk driving and more like something out of a crime thriller. Now, according to the defense, O'Keefe was never hit by a car. They argue that he was beaten inside the house and then dragged outside while his so-called friends made sure their hands were clean. Now, their biggest argument? His injuries. O'Keefe had severe head trauma, orbital fractures, and deep cuts on his arm, injuries that forensic experts testified were not consistent with being hit by a car. In fact, They were more in line with being punched, kicked, or thrown against a hard surface. And here's where things take an even darker turn. O'Keefe's autopsy revealed something very unusual: canine bites. That's right. He had injuries consistent with a dog attack. Now, why is this important? Because Brian Albert just so happened to have a German Shepherd. Now, the defense argues this could mean O'Keefe was attacked inside the house and possibly even bitten by the dog before being left outside. And let's not forget the witnesses. According to the group inside the house, O'Keefe never even entered. Every single person at that party, every single one, insists that he never walked through the front door. The defense argues that this is a coordinated lie, an effort to keep anyone from asking what really happened inside that house. And then there's the taillight. So prosecutors say broken pieces of Reed's taillight were found on the scene, proof that she hit O'Keefe, but the defense, they argue that the taillight was smashed after the fact, planted evidence to make it look like Reed was responsible. Because here's the thing, earlier in the night, Reed's taillight was completely intact. If it broke when she hit O'Keefe, why didn't anyone hear a crash? Why didn't she notice? And why did it just so happen to break in a way that perfectly fit to the prosecution's story? Now, from 12:30 a.m. to 6 a.m., John O'Keefe lay outside in the snow. The temperature had dropped to below 20 degrees. If he was still conscious when he was left out there, he likely wasn't for long. Now, meanwhile, Karen Reed was desperately trying to reach him. Phone records show she called and texted him multiple times throughout the night. She even drove back to the area looking for him. At 6 a.m., she and her friend Carrie Roberts finally found him, laying face down in the snow. His body was stiff, his lips were blue, and he was completely unresponsive. Reed screamed. She performed CPR. She called 911, and in the chaos, she blurted out the phrase the prosecutors would cling to for the next 2 years. Quote, "Did I hit him?"
Did I hit him?
But was that a confession, or was it a frantic, guilt-ridden question of someone who had just found the man she loved dying in front of her? Now, in the days that followed, law enforcement zeroed in on Karen Reed as their prime suspect. To them, the evidence was straightforward: the broken taillight, the DNA, her panic statement. She was charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter while driving under the influence, and leaving the scene of an accident. But Reed's defense had one final question. What if they had the wrong suspect? Because if what they claim is true, if O'Keefe was attacked inside the house, if he was left to die by people who were supposed to protect him, then it wasn't just a wrongful prosecution. It was a cover-up of massive proportions. And the people behind it, they weren't just witnesses. They were law enforcement officers, the very people in charge of finding the truth. So now, the question remains, was Karen Reed a reckless drunk driver who left her boyfriend to die, or is she just the scapegoat in one of the most shocking police cover-ups in recent history? Karen Reed didn't wake up on January 29th, 2022, expecting to be the prime suspect in a murder case, but that's exactly what happened. By sunrise, John O'Keefe was dead, and within days, Reed was arrested and charged. The police had their story. The evidence seemed to back it up. And just like that, a woman who had spent the night frantically searching for her boyfriend was suddenly being painted as a cold-blooded killer. Now, let's talk about the investigation, or depending on who you ask, the so-called investigation. Prosecutors say it was all pretty straightforward. Reed hit O'Keefe with her car outside Brian Albert's house, left him there, and drove home. They claim the evidence is overwhelming. The taillight fragments at the scene, O'Keefe's DNA on the vehicle, and of course, her panic question, did I hit him? The Norfolk County District Attorney's Office wasted no time. Within days, Reed was arrested and charged with manslaughter, motor vehicle homicide, and leaving the scene of an accident. Then in June 2022, they upped the ante, charging her with second-degree murder. But here's the problem. While the prosecution was busy building their case against Reed, her defense team was uncovering something a lot more disturbing. Let's start with the investigators themselves. The lead detective on the case, that would be Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor, a man with long-standing personal ties to the Albert family. The same family that owned the house where O'Keefe was found. The same family whose party guests all claimed he never walked through the door. Conflict of interest? You bet, to say the least. And then there's Proctor's text messages. During the investigation, Proctor was caught sending highly inappropriate, biased, and even celebratory texts about the case. In one message, he referred to Reed as a, quote, whack job before the trial even began. In another, he laughed about how she was falling apart under the weight of the accusations. Now, these aren't exactly the words of an objective investigator. These are the words of someone who had already made up his mind. Then there's the matter of the taillight. Prosecutors claim that fragments of Reed's taillight were found at the scene, proving she hit O'Keefe. But there's a problem. Witnesses saw her taillight intact earlier that night. So when exactly did it break? Now, the defense argues that it was tampered with after the fact, that someone smashed it to later fit the prosecution's narrative. And also, let's talk about the DNA evidence. So the prosecution says that O'Keefe's DNA was found on the taillight of Reed's car, which they claim is proof of impact. But forensic experts hired by the defense say otherwise. O'Keefe's injuries were not consistent with being struck by a car. His deep skull fractures, orbital bruising, and arm abrasions were more in line with a beating. So the police took Reed's Lexus into custody for evidence. Now, at this point, the defense was starting to see a pattern. From the start, Reed wasn't being investigated. She was being targeted. The case wasn't about what had happened that night. It was about who the police wanted to blame. And if the defense was right, it wasn't just bias. It was a full-on cover-up. Because if O'Keefe really was attacked inside the house, if he was beaten and then left outside to freeze to death, then the real question isn't, did Karen Reed hit him? The real question is, who is being protected? And why were they so desperate to make sure all eyes were on Karen Reed? All right, so Karen Reed's trial wasn't just a legal battle. It was a full-blown spectacle. Now, on one side, you had the prosecution confidently presenting their hit-and-run theory. On the other side, the defense painting a picture of a police cover-up straight out of a crime thriller. And in the middle of it all, a jury that had no idea just how complicated things were about to get. Now, the trial kicked off in April 2024. And from day one, the prosecution was all in on their version of events, as they usually are. They were saying Reed was drunk and angry, hit O'Keefe with her car, left him to die in the snow, and then tried to cover it up. Now, their key pieces of evidence, the broken taillight, the DNA on her vehicle, and now the infamous, quote, "Did I hit him?" But the defense wasn't there just to argue. They were there to destroy the prosecution's case. First, they brought in forensic experts, real, credible scientists that we sometimes seldom see in these trials, but these were real, who testified that O'Keefe's injuries didn't match those of a pedestrian struck by a car. Now, his skull fractures, more consistent with blunt force trauma. The bruising around his eyes, a sign of a severe beating, not an impact with a car. And then there were the dog bite injuries, because, nothing about this case was straightforward. So that's when the defense went on the offensive. They started picking apart the so-called, quote, investigation. Why was Trooper Michael Proctor, a man closely connected to people inside Brian Albert's house, allowed to lead the case? Why were there text messages between police officers mocking Reed and celebrating her downfall? And why was every single person inside that house so adamant that O'Keefe never walked through the door? It didn't take long before the courtroom felt less like a trial and more like an expose on police misconduct. Now, the defense pointed out that the key evidence had been mishandled or worse, tampered with. The taillight fragments found at the scene magically appeared after the police had already been there. Now, then, in one of the most dramatic moments of the trial, the defense grilled the lead investigator on the stand, forcing him to admit that, some things in the case weren't exactly handled by the book. You could almost hear the prosecution's confidence cracking. It was crazy. But if you thought this trial was about to end with a big courtroom revelation, think again. So, weeks after the testimony, after hours of cross-examinations, after enough expert witnesses to fill a small college lecture hall, the jury went into deliberation. And then, nothing. They were deadlocked, completely stuck, which happens. Some believed Reed was guilty, some believed she had been framed, but no one could agree on a verdict. After 5 long days of deliberation, the judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. And just like that, after months of courtroom drama, after millions of people following every update, the case wasn't over. It was just beginning. Again. All right, so we got a mistrial. After months of testimony, weeks of arguments, and 5 days of jury deliberation, the case that had captivated a nation ended in a legal shrug. The jury just couldn't do it. They were split. Some convinced Karen Reed was guilty, others believing she had been framed. And when a jury can't agree, the law doesn't either. So, on July 1st, 2024, Judge Beverly Canone declared a mistrial, leaving Karen Reed in legal limbo. Now, for some, it was proof that the case against her was weak. For others, it meant justice had yet to be served, unfortunately. But here's the thing about a mistrial. It's not a win. It's just a delay. And the prosecution wasn't about to let Reed walk away. So Norfolk County District Attorney Michael Morrissey immediately announced plans for a retrial. Reed's legal team, on the other hand, wasn't having it. They argued that retrying her on the same charges, especially after learning that some jurors were already leaning toward acquitting her, was double jeopardy. Their motion to dismiss the charges were quickly denied, though. So the fight continued. As Reed's lawyers prepared for round 2, things outside the courtroom got even messier. So in Canton, the community was deeply divided. People weren't just watching this case. They were living it. Local businesses displayed signs supporting Reed's innocence, while others stood firmly with O'Keefe's family. Residents clashed in town meetings, in Facebook groups, and even in the streets. And then there was the media. By now, the case had gone national. True crime podcasts like this one, investigative reporters, and even Netflix were picking apart every detail, trying to make sense of a story that had too many twists to count. So one of the most vocal supporters of the cover-up theory was a local blogger named Aiden Kearney, better known as Turtle Boy. He'd been loud, relentless, and unapologetic in his defense of Reed, calling the case against her a, quote, complete sham. But his deep dive into the investigation didn't just ruffle feathers. It got him arrested. Authorities charged him with witness intimidation after he allegedly harassed people connected to the case. Some saw it as justice, and others saw it as an attempt to silence anyone questioning the official story. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more chaotic, O'Keefe's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Reed in August of 2024. This wasn't a criminal case. This was civil court, where the burden of proof is lower, 51%. And a conviction isn't needed to hold someone financially responsible. So now, Karen Reed wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was also fighting to keep from being financially ruined. As 2025 approached, one thing was clear. This case was far from over, and both sides were gearing up for another brutal legal showdown. The stakes, higher than ever. If Reed was convicted, she could spend decades in prison. If she was acquitted, it would be a devastating blow to the prosecution and an even bigger scandal for law enforcement. Because if the defense was right, if this really was a cover-up, then this case wasn't just about Karen Reed. It was about a system that protected its own at any cost. And this time, the whole world was and is watching. Okay, so Karen Reed's first trial may have ended in a mistrial, but make no mistake, this case is far from over. The prosecution is doubling down, preparing to put her back on trial this April, and Reed's defense team is gearing up for another battle, determined to prove she was framed. And the stakes? They couldn't be any higher. If convicted, Reed faces life in prison. If acquitted, it would be a catastrophic failure for the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office, not to mention a huge black mark on the Massachusetts State Police and the Canton Police Department, because if Reed walks free, it's not just her name that gets cleared. It's the entire investigation that gets called into question. And if that happens, then the real question isn't, did Karen Reed kill John O'Keefe? It's, who did? Now, the thing is, this isn't just a legal battle anymore. It's a national obsession. The case has exploded across social media, true crime blogs, and mainstream news outlets everywhere. Everyone has a theory. Everyone has a side. And if you have one, be sure to leave it in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. But in Canton, the divide has only deepened. Some people are all in on the cover-up theory, convinced that the people inside Brian Albert's house that night know exactly what happened to John O'Keefe, and that they've been protected from day one. Now, others see Reed as a manipulative woman who made a terrible mistake and is now trying to weasel her way out of accountability. Now, meanwhile, Reed remains free on bail, waiting for her second day in court. Her team has new lawyers, new experts, and a plan to tear apart the prosecution's case once and for all. They're expected to come out swinging, basically, challenging not just the evidence, but the entire integrity of the investigation. The prosecution, on the other hand, is under massive pressure, to say the least. Now, after the first trial ended without a conviction, they need a win. They need a jury that won't hesitate, and they need to convince the public that this isn't a cover-up, it's justice. But the closer this case gets to trial, the harder it becomes to separate fact from conspiracy, truth from manipulation, and justice from damage control. Because here's the thing, if Reed is guilty, then the first trial was a disaster, and the prosecution has to prove it all over again. But if she's innocent, then the real killers are still out there. And the people who protected them, they've been running this case from the start. The clock is ticking. The next trial is coming, and no matter the outcome, one thing is certain. This case will change everything. All right, y'all, we already have an update in this case. While I'm recording this episode, it has just dropped a little bit ago that Trooper Michael Proctor was fired for conduct during the Karen Reed murder case. Just wanted to hop in here. It says, "My decision to terminate Mr. Proctor follows a thorough, fair, and impartial process." It says, "Disgraced Massachusetts State Police Trooper Michael Proctor, who rose to infamy over his handling of the Karen Reed murder case, has been fired." The agency had announced Wednesday. State Police Colonel Jeffrey Noble terminated Proctor at the recommendation of the trial board, which found him guilty of unsatisfactory performance and consuming alcohol while on duty. Noble's personal order specifically points to Proctor's conduct as lead investigator on Reed's case, particularly the vulgar texts he sent to family, friends, and co-workers. So, wow. Okay. This thing is going to just keep on going. So be sure to stick with us because this is far from over. Now, the case was scheduled to be retried in January, but both sides wanted a little longer to prepare for this key evidentiary hearing. So it is now set for April. So stay tuned. And also be sure to like this video, subscribe to Creepalachia. Did you like this story? I want to do more of these and lay out some cases. So please, your feedback means everything. We're trying to make a good channel here. So be sure to remember we are on Facebook and TikTok as well. And if you're on the Apple or Spotify version of this story, be sure to leave a review. It takes a few minutes and really helps the show. And stay tuned because we will be covering the Karen Reed retrial when it happens through the verdict, and we will see how this plays out. And above all else, everyone out there, please remember, long live Appalachia.